Okay, we'll get started and you can keep letting people in. Well, it's great to see so many old and new friends. I always love seeing people that I haven't seen in 30 years. So welcome to everyone who's joining us for the first in a series of webinars on key early learning and childcare policy topics. I'm Martha Friendly. I'm the Executive Director of the Childcare Resource and Research Unit, and I'm one of the leads in the SSHRC-funded project that's sponsoring this webinar series, Reimagining Care Work Policies. Before introducing the panel and the topic for tonight, I want to briefly set out the context for our discussion tonight. First, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from today's downtown Toronto, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, which is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And participants, if you'd like to, you can please put your own land acknowledgements in the chat. Well, this webinar series originated with a symposium on childcare policy that we held in Ottawa last June. And this was sponsored by an academic research project in which Childcare Now and the Childcare Resource and Research Unit are partners, together with quite a few other individual researchers and groups who are interested in childcare, parental leave, and employment policy, which is what the project is about. Today, we in childcare are at a critical moment in a 50-year history of childcare advocacy and policy in Canada. It's hard to believe that it's only been a year and a half since Canada's first woman finance minister at the federal level, Chrystia Freeland, announced in the 2021 federal budget the federal government's plan to build a Canada-wide system of early learning and childcare at long last. The finance minister said the plan would drive economic growth. It would finally give women a secure bridge to the paid workforce, and it would grow to give every child access to high quality early childhood education and care. Minister Freeland said that building the system would be a transformative project on the scale with the work of previous generations who built our public school system and public health care. Now, how would the federal government do this? Well, by doing what advocates and feminists have been asking federal governments to do since the Royal Commission on the Status of Women in 1970, take leadership and use its considerable fiscal capacity as the federal spending power to convince the provincial and territorial governments to meet a number of early learning and childcare goals. While we all know what was in the federal budget, we should reflect on the magnitude and significance of the commitment that was made. $30 billion for regulated childcare over 5 years starting in 2021, and this is above and beyond previous multi-year commitments made in the 2017 budget. A minimum of $9.2 billion a year after 25-26. So that is money that would be staying in federal budgets. 2.5 billion of the 30 billion is earmarked to support the 2018 Indigenous Early Learning and Childcare Framework, the IELCC, which was developed by the 3 national Indigenous governance organizations that represent Métis, First Nations, and Inuit peoples. Some of the funds are being used to put in place a new federal Early Learning and Childcare Secretariat and a new National Advisory Council on Early Learning and Childcare. And new federal legislation, childcare legislation, will soon be tabled in Parliament. Soon, we hear. Working from the assumption that it would take some years to transform Canada's market childcare provision to the quality system we have long envisioned, the federal budget set out some key markers for building the Canada-wide system. It would be primarily not-for-profit and public through growth. Parent fees would be reduced substantially, down by an average of 50% by the end of this year, 2022, and then further down to an average of $10 a day by March 31st, 2026. The system of early learning and childcare would be inclusive, and it would grow to be universal, meaning for everyone. And it would make quality childcare available to all who want it over time through federally funded expansion everywhere in Canada. And finally, the Canada-wide system would raise the quality of childcare programs. Key to this, and the topic we're talking about tonight, would be ensuring that those who work in childcare would be finally properly valued, qualified, and compensated. And as you know, within a year of that historic April 2021 budget announcement, agreements had been signed between the federal government and each of the 13 provinces and territories. These agreements and the action plans negotiated along with them are the mechanism that will form the foundation of building the childcare system. Specifically, these lay out what each province and territory has agreed to do between 2021 and 2023, after which a new set of action plans will be agreed to that will provide opportunities for course corrections. So that would be for any thing that needed to be changed. It's important to keep in mind that while this all provides the opportunity to build the childcare system we want, it's important to remember that it is just the foundation. To actually get to the quality, universal, inclusive childcare system we all envision, we need to know what works best, what we want, what to pay attention to, and what can be and needs to be corrected over time. So that's what this webinar is about. We in the childcare community need to take stock of this tremendous achievement, which was a huge victory for advocates. But we must also understand what still has to be achieved. What kind of policy and initiatives are required to build the Canada-wide system of early learning and childcare we have envisioned for so long? So this webinar series, of which this is the first installment, is built around critical components of system building and the interdependence connections between those elements, as we have laid out in Childcare Now's Roadmap to Affordable Childcare for All. This sets out 10 elements of childcare system building in some detail. And I'm going to ask Erica to put a link to this roadmap in the chat in case anybody hasn't looked at it in some detail. It's really important to look at it. So tonight's webinar focuses on the roadmap's element number 7, workforce strategies. So what it says, it's fairly long, but it says, a well-qualified ELCC workforce is central to a high-quality ELCC system. Without it, services will not be high quality and expansion will be hampered. The problems of recruitment and retention of a qualified ELCC workforce are complex. These can be resolved only by tackling layered but interrelated factors. These factors are closely linked to how ELCC services are funded and whether public funding is sufficient. There's more detail in the roadmap itself, which I'll leave you all to read some of the details of what that actually means. But simply put, and what we really want to talk about tonight is that getting the childcare workforce issues right and solving the current childcare workforce crisis is pivotal for building a successful childcare system. Without this, expansion of quality services cannot occur. So it's not only pivotal, but truly urgent to more than get started on childcare workforce issues now. I want to turn to tonight's panel, all of whom are experts on the childcare workforce. And after the 3 panelists have made their presentations, we'll be taking up your questions. So while the presentations are going on, please put questions or points that you want to make in the chat. And Morn is going to take them up, and we're going to talk about as many as we can after the panel. So just to say that the panel includes Christopher Smith up first, who is the Associate Executive Director of the Edmonton-based Muttart Foundation, leading its work on early learning and childcare. He's a member of the Steering Committee for the Community University Partnership for the Study of Children, Youth, and Families at the University of Alberta, and of the Edmonton Council for Early Learning and Care. Jane Beach is a research and polity consultant based in Victoria, BC. For decades, she has undertaken studies on the early childhood workforce. Jane is a member of the Statistics Canada Expert Advisory Group for ELCC and of BC's Implementation Committee for the Canada-wide Early Learning and Childcare Agreement. And Carolyn Ferns is Policy Coordinator at the Ontario Coalition for Better Childcare. Carolyn has a bachelor's degree in early childhood education and a master's degree in early childhood studies from Toronto Metropolitan University. aka Ryerson. She is a member of the boards of directors of both Childcare Now and the Childcare Resource and Research Unit. So with that, I'll turn it over first to Chris, and then we'll go to Jane and then Carolyn.
Thanks, Martha. I'm going to try and share my screen, so hopefully this will work. Is everyone seeing that okay, or? Yeah, okay. So welcome to the webinar this evening, and appreciate the chance to be part of such a illustrious panel. My initial remarks, I'm focusing on the education of early childhood educators to sort of set the ball rolling, and then Jane and Carolyn are going to talk about the compensation and working conditions. And I think obviously it's fair to say that whilst the three are related, we're actually looking at them individually. So if you can bear with us in terms of that expression. And I think just as a starting point, I think Martha reminded me to say that when we think about the early learning and childcare workforce, what we need to also think about is how we understand early learning and childcare itself, because I think part of the transformational agreements that are being signed is that we're actually hopefully we're starting to approach early learning and childcare much more as a public good in a way that differentiates it from a private service or a private commodity. And if we think about early learning and childcare as a public good, then that changes profoundly how we think about early learning and childcare educators and their work. And I think it's not without coincidence that when we think about system building, and Martha reminded us this, is we are not going to build a high quality early learning and childcare system without a high quality workforce. And the education of early childhood educators is going to be absolutely central to that. So in terms of my, whoops, trying to get the next slide. Okay. Can you see the next slide? Oh, sorry. Yep. Okay. So in terms of the
sorry, Christopher. Yeah. You may just want to put it on present mode. It's a little bit small for folks here, and it doesn't seem to be switching between slides.
Okay. So
I'm also happy to share too.
Yeah. Do you want to do that? I seem totally technologically adept in that.
Hey, it wouldn't be a Zoom call without a tech issue. I will get that going.
Okay. So I stop sharing then, Erica?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Is everyone up? So we can go to the second slide.
That's better.
Okay. So in terms of the agreements, and again, probably like all of you, I mean, I was struck by the announcements in budget April 2021, and I realize, as Martha said, I mean, we're all standing on the shoulders of giants that have brought us to this particular point. Some of the giants are, like Martha, they're tiny giants, but they've been working at this for an awfully long time. And so the agreements really represent a profound and significant shift in how we think about early learning and childcare, and hopefully also how we think about the workforce itself. And the agreements, we're all fairly familiar with them now, but what I also make reference to, and it's at the bottom point, is there is a very important parallel agreement with Indigenous communities through the Indigenous Early Learning and Childcare Agreement. And that talks specifically to the principles of Indigenous early learning and childcare system building. And that really strongly reflects the distinctions-based approaches, but it also is strongly embedded in self-determination. And so I am not an authority and expert in Indigenous early learning and childcare, and so I won't be speaking specifically to the Indigenous early learning and childcare workforce. I think that's going to come up in session 3. But if you actually look at the agreements themselves, what you see is that common phrase. It's that valuing the early childhood workforce and providing them with training and development opportunities. And that appears in the vision section of each agreement, fairly common language in 12 of the 13. And then in the individual agreements, what jurisdictions do is they kind of map out what it is that they're going to deliver. Sorry, I can go back. Erica. Sorry, they're going to map out what they're going to deliver under that agreement commensurate with that wording. And I don't know about you, but again, my initial report is I don't find that language particularly transformational. It doesn't quite grasp me in terms of the importance of the workforce. And one of the key questions that we've got to ask and we've got to reach agreement on as a sector is what is the shared vision for that pan-Canadian childcare system, because what we anticipate that pan-Canadian childcare system will be able to do will actually shape what our early learning and childcare workforce looks like. And if you look at the 3 points I've identified there, I think it's, for me, the framing of the agreements is initially driven by the support for the labor force participation of parents and young children. And I think it's going to be really important that we also highlight the second elements there, the fostering young children's early learning and development. And then critically, we look at the early learning and childcare system of a way of advancing equity and inclusion. So when we're thinking about the early learning and childcare workforce and its education, it's got to be prepared to do all of those 3 things and perhaps more. And when you look at the agreements themselves, this is sort of a real tension for me. When I went through the agreements, I was struck by the relative modesty of the investments in the workforce and the very modest goals that were set for early child educators. So if I look at the Alberta agreement, which is the one that I know best, if you like, is out of the total of $3.8 billion of investments, only $300 million has been allocated to the workforce. And that seems like a relatively small amount given the centrality of the workforce. So one of the questions that I've sort of raised internally is that a provincial and territorial government's going to come forward with their own resources to support the development of the workforce, because something's very critically missing in terms of the current structure. And then if you look at the educational goals that have been set for the workforce, they're actually, again, they're fairly modest. So if I can get the next slide, please, Erica. So in terms of the educational preparation of early child educators, I mean, what the research shows is it shows us a lot. We know a lot more now than we did a decade ago, but there's still some things that are unknown. But what's quite clear from the research is that the educational preparation of early child educators, it matters. That the formal pre-service education that ECEs participate in shapes the quality, the process quality of the programs and services in which they work. So education matters. So highly qualified, better prepared early childhood educators are better able to sustain those kind of enriching and stimulating interactions with children that support their development and learning. And if you look at Canada's performance, how does Canada rate in terms of its comparison of its education of early childhood educators? We actually fall significantly below the international benchmark. So looking at the OECD studies, starting strong 6, when we look at what is the common preparation and recognizing there's differences between systems and there's difference in roles, what we see is that the lead educator in those countries with more developed systems of early learning and childcare, the qualification is the bachelor degree. So it's the ISCED, the International Standard Classification Level 6. And what that is the most standard qualification for early childhood educators in those lead roles in supporting program and services and delivery. And then when we look at our Canadian context, and you know this as well as I do, the majority of Canadian provinces and jurisdictions, their ECEs, our workforces, their terminal qualification is it's a shorter cycle tertiary qualification. It's a certificate or a diploma. It's not a degree. And so we're at that level 5. But what we also have, we have staff with lower level credentials. And what's also critically is when we look at our fields, when we look at our workforces, we actually have a number of staff who work with exemptions from formal qualifications and requirements. So our early learning and childcare workforce is not particularly strong in terms of its pre-service education. What we also know about pre-service education, it's not just a matter of doing a degree level qualification. It has to be a degree in a related field. It has to be a degree that's a quality public education supported degree. And the content of that curriculum has to include a fairly significant domain, if you like, in terms of everything from playful learning right through to field placements. And I'm going to focus particularly on the field placements because we just did some work in Alberta with students completing degrees. And field placements are incredibly important because field placements for many students are their first exposure to working in the field. And what we hope in the field placements is that they get to work alongside a skilled professional who has high quality practice. And that experience shapes how that student sees the field. And so again, our educational preparation at the moment, it's fairly modest. And so when I look at the agreements, what do I see as the potential? And what we know is, if you look at, again, the structural characteristics of systems can support advances in early childhood educator qualifications by embedding that in policy and regulation. So you can regulate what you believe are the appropriate standards for pre-service education within your systems, and then you work towards those over time. And what's interesting when you look at the Canada-wide agreements, when you look at the individual agreements, provinces and territory side, most of them have determined that what they're going to do is they're going to actually increase the proportion of educators who meet the existing certification requirements, which we know are modest, but they're not actually going to raise the educational requirements for early learning childcare. So that, I think that's something that we really need to think about going forward. If we are going to have a high quality system, then do we not need to look at advancing those pre-service educational standards? And the one thing that, again, I'm going to draw your attention at the bottom is an outstanding question. And it's Kathy Nutbrown's report from the UK in 2012 that really brought this to my attention. How are we going to approach the pre-service education of family childcare providers? Are we going to look at the pre-service education of family childcare providers in the same way in terms of certification and qualification requirements as we are for center-based staff? Or are we going to say something different? And what Kathy Nutbrown said is that she could see no reasonable reason for not requiring family childcare providers to have the same educational preparation as early childhood educators in center-based services. So that's a particular thing to focus on, given that we're looking at service expansion through family childcare. If I can get the next slide, please, Erica. In terms of the ongoing preparation, professional learning of early childhood educators, again, the literature is a little bit more complex. But what we see in this area in the research is that the ongoing professional learning can improve process quality. It can. So it's not that you can use professional learning as a substitute for pre-service education, but you can use well-designed professional learning to support improvements in practice. And what they also, there's some very interesting findings in the literature saying that if we approach professional learning in an organized and comprehensive and well-considered fashion, what we can also use, we can use professional learning to support the well-being of early childhood educators. It can support their self-efficacy, and it can even address issues relating to staff burnout. But what we need to be very conscious of is how do you actually provide and deliver comprehensive programs of professional learning for workforces that are facing significant demands? And what the OECD found through its TALIS survey is that at the moment, professional learning requirements for ECEs are laid on top of very challenging work environments. And so what we see is we need to recognize that there are important time and resource constraints. So if we're asking early childhood educators to participate in professional learning, let's not attach it to the end of a very busy day. If we're asking them to participate in professional learning, let's not say there's very significant costs. So we have to think through, how do we provide professional learning and ongoing development for early childhood educators in a way that meets their particular working conditions? And what's positive, I think, in terms of the agreements is that the majority of the agreements actually do pay some attention to professional learning for early childhood educators. Now, is that as a substitution for pre-service education? I think the answer may be yes, but let's take the positive that it's actually there. And at the moment, when you look across the OECD, the standards around professional learning aren't that strong. So in Canada, we currently have 6 provinces that are attending to this. And what I found is a finding very interesting in the literature. There's a finding suggesting that for staff who are entering the field with perhaps lower levels of pre-service education, well-designed and quality professional learning can actually boost their practice, their knowledge, and their skills. But let's be absolutely clear. What we're not talking about in professional learning is a series of one-off workshops. There is no evidence in the research that one-off poorly designed workshops support professional learning that advances the field. What we need to look at is a much more deliberate professional learning approach that's responsive to context, that's practical, and that critically includes opportunities for educators to self-reflect. If I can get the final slide, please, Erica. So in terms of context, what's next? Well, what I would say to you is at the moment, we haven't got out of the starting box. In terms of thinking about education of ECEs within our Canada-wide agreements, we have not got out of the starting blocks. Our initial agreements essentially say that the status quo is okay. And I don't think that's what's going to move us towards a high quality system. So what I would anticipate is in the next round of 3-year action plans, we would see comprehensive workforce strategies that include commitments to education. We would see additional provincial and territorial investments in the workforces. I think there's a gap, there's a funding gap that needs to be addressed. I hope over time we support the move to higher pre-service education requirements. And we're looking at the minimum requirement for certification should be the ISC D5, which is that short cycle tertiary post-secondary qualification, a diploma. We need to link ongoing professional learning to ongoing certification. That's part of a profession. But critically, we need to think, what are the multiple and complementary pathways to credentialing for ECEs. We are not trying to create barriers for ECEs to advance their learning and education. And so we need to have multiple and complementary pathways. How do we work with educators who have very significant home and work-life commitments in terms of making post-secondary education more accessible? And critically, this is going to involve provincial and territorial governments working in partnerships with the provincial early childhood associations. This needs to be a shared endeavor. This is not about doing something to the field on behalf of a set of constituents. This is about working with the field. And I would argue there's a role for federal leadership. There's a role for federal leadership. I think most of the provinces and territories are in a similar boat in terms of pre-service education and professional learning. So is there a role of professional learnership? Sorry, if I can get the final slide, Erica. Two things. I'll draw your attention to Starting Strong 6. One of the Starting Strong is an excellent summary of educational preparation and professional learning. And also draw your attention on the right-hand side to the work that the Childcare Human Resources Sector Council did. And what's staggering to me, that work is 20 years old. It's as relevant now as it was 20 years ago. In fact, now it's perhaps more relevant as we look at system building. So I'm just going to conclude there, Erica, and thank you for managing my slides and making me look good technically, if nothing else. Thanks.
So can we arrange to go on to Jane?
Yes, you can. I just will share my screen. Okay, is that good? Yes, okay. Thanks. So, as you know, we're going to solve all the issues in the workforce in this 1 hour webinar. So at the outset, I'd just like to say that the workforce issues and challenges are complex. They're linked to many other aspects of system building. And while there are many common issues, there are also some variations across provinces and territories in what those issues are. So I can only begin to touch on some of these issues in 10 minutes, and I'm going to focus on some of the things we know about retention and what makes a difference. That's my slide. Advancing. Okay. So, of course, wages and working conditions are a key starting point, but there are a lot of other factors that affect individuals' decisions either to stay in the sector or to leave it. So working conditions, including those that can be built into job descriptions and contractual arrangement, there are others that cannot, that are more about the working environment, the leadership within the individual programs, opportunities for ongoing professional learning, and individuals feeling valued for their work. But I would like to just touch on wages for a minute, not the amount of money, but how public support for wages is happening in very different ways in provinces. So first of all, a number of provinces and territories are providing wage top-ups for certain members of the workforce. And so it may be limited to those with a particular level of certification. It may be limited to those earning below some identified threshold. So in some jurisdictions, certain hours of work are eligible for top-ups and others aren't. If a staff is, they're often not paid their top-up if they're ill, if they're on vacation, if they're away from the Center for Professional Development. And also wage top-ups are usually related to certification, but they don't address experience, nor do they address the job position. And they're also usually identified separately in a pay package. So the amounts can vary on any particular pay period. They're not secure. They can easily be withdrawn if government decides to do so. They also create this huge unnecessary burden, both on operators who have to track their workforce hours of work, and they have to submit that on a regular basis to government, and then somebody in the childcare branch or whoever does this in government to review those files before issuing a check. And it really perpetuates a market approach to childcare in that wages are largely driven by parent fees, with government providing a top up through a grant process that it does little more than raise the floor of the lowest paid in the workforce. So some other provinces and some have committed to developing salary or wage scales, and those do a much better job of providing, predictable incomes for staff. It's based on the value of the work, the qualifications of the educator, the years of experience, and their roles and responsibilities within the different positions. And ideally, this is paid through core operating funding as opposed to a whack of money that's set aside, that is in isolation from the rest of the funding formula that's necessary for centers to thrive. Another thing to take into account, though, that I'm not sure a lot of provinces are doing is in developing wage scales, taking into account not just what the child staff ratios are and how many certified staff you need for those positions, but building in time for staff to be off the floor, for non-contact time with children that requires additional staffing to allow for that. That's a really important consideration. So, okay. So the OECD Starting Strong Teaching and Learning International Survey, the TALIS survey, it's the first large-scale international survey of early childhood staff and leaders. It's done in 9 countries, and for years it's been done with teachers and leaders in the school system. But this is the first time it's been done for early childhood education. And there's as Chris mentioned, there's a lot of really helpful and useful information, seeing trends where there are variations. These countries are really different, one from the other. But I'm actually stealing from their thinking about staff well-being, job satisfaction, and likelihood to stay in the sector has to do with the balance between the demands of the job, the resources they have to do that job, and job rewards. So if you look on the left-hand side, those job demands are fairly consistent across the sector, that there are particular hours that people are working. They play multiple roles generally in their work, how the work is organized, what the group size is like, and what the regulatory environment is like. So those all affect the demands of the job. And then the job resources are things that may or may not be out of the box and available to everybody. So the pre and in-service education, so the pre-service education is not necessarily a resource, but the resource is about access to it. How can educators get access to pre-service education and as well as ongoing education and professional learning? Is there an induction and mentoring support within the center, especially for new staff? Do staff have control over decisions in how they operate their programs? Do they have support from center leadership? What's the collaboration like with other staff? Do they have access to good program materials and resources at their disposal? What's the physical environment like? And do they get regular feedback and appraisal? So the TALIS survey, like looking across the 9 countries that participated, summarize the job resources in that way. And then if they're all in place, they have an impact on the rewards of the job, which is the quality of the earnings. Do staff have job security? Do they have strong contracts? Are there good career progression opportunities for them? And they look at staff well-being in 3 different categories, each one having an impact on their decisions to stay in the sector or not. So the first one is emotional well-being. Do they love their job? Do they get satisfaction from working with children all day? Also, the cognitive well-being. Do they feel that their preparation is adequate to make them confident in their role? Do they know what they're doing? We know, for example, for a lot of Canadian surveys that generally staff feel quite well prepared to work with typical children and much less prepared to work with, say, children that require additional supports or children facing trauma or other challenges. And then the social well-being, which is often overlooked, and that's the quality and depth of the working relationship they have with their peers, with the center supervisors and leaders, and with parents and children. And then finally, do they feel recognized for the job they're doing and feel valued by others? So the intention to stay or leave and the quality of staff interactions are interrelated, and one has an impact on another. But why is this so important that, we care about staff well-being and whether or not they stay in the sector? Because it has an impact on the quality and provision for children and families. And that is what we're all striving for, that better wages, working conditions, and work environment for staff mean higher quality of care for children. So what's next for the workforce? So first of all, we really need to ensure that the funding for wages, benefits, and the supportive work environment are part of core operating funding given to centers. We need to ensure that there are opportunities for increased qualifications. As Chris mentioned, we really fall short according to international standards on levels of education, and we need to make sure there's easy access to that. I think we really need to push for a national workforce strategy. So, every province and territory is not out figuring this on their own and coming up with all these different ways of addressing the same issues. And then building on the extensive body of pan-Canadian research, as Chris mentioned, the Childcare Human Resources Sector Council, which did its last piece of work 10 years ago. But in case you don't know, what all the information and resources and materials that they have ever produced are still alive on a website, and many of thanks to some who are on this call who are handling keeping that website going. But the resources are still really valid, but we need to build on that and move forward. So finally, just a few key points. Transformation is necessary. We have to move away from a market approach and move to a publicly managed and funded system. The commitments under the Canada-wide agreements cannot be met without a stable, skilled, qualified, and satisfied workforce. There's no expansion without a good workforce. There's no quality without an appropriate workforce. And the workforce issues need to be addressed, not in isolation by a grant that gives them, a couple of dollars an hour extra, but it needs to be an integral part of system building. And we really need to, our starting place, I believe, really needs to be a set of values and principles that guide, comprehensive policy framework and ongoing policy development. And that's it for me. Thank you.
And so we're going to move on to Carolyn Ferns. I don't see you in a little window, Carolyn, but I know you're out. Oh, there you are. You're in a big window. Great. So Carolyn is the third participant, and after that, we're going to open up for questions that have been put into the chat. So continue putting any of your questions or comments into the chat, and Morn is going to be picking them up for the discussion after Carolyn's presentation.
Thanks so much, Martha. And I hope everyone can see the slides. Just nod your head if you can. Yeah, good. All right, great. So I want to talk a little bit about some work that I've been doing with the Ontario Coalition for Better Childcare in partnership with the Association of Early Childhood Educators and the Atkinson Center. And I think I saw Bernice in the chat there. So great to have her there as well, because she's also a partner on this project. And we've been working for several years now on the Decent Work Project, which is about building worker voice in the childcare movement, about building an ECE-led movement for decent work and pay. And these issues seem to be never more important than they are today. And in 2021, we did, through this project, a survey report called Forgotten on the Frontline. And this was done sort of in the middle of the pandemic. And, while I have been a member of the childcare workforce as an early child educator, and then studied the childcare workforce and advocated for the childcare workforce for many years. I'd never seen anything quite like what we were hearing in this report from childcare workers and early child educators in the middle of the pandemic. And we called it Forgotten on the Front Line because that's exactly what one of the ECs said they felt like. And what we saw was, numbers of ECEs reporting that they were considering leaving the field because of the stress and decrease in job satisfaction that they were experiencing. And then, of course, over the next several months after we had this kind of warning bell go off, it was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. We saw, in my province in Ontario, childcare centers having to close rooms and then having to close entire programs. In Ontario right now, there are at least 3 whole childcare centers that are completely closed down in places as far from Manitoulin Island, one in the southwest in Sarnia, because they cannot staff with early child educators. So, we know the workforce crisis has been with us for a long time. It's predated the pandemic, but it's become so much worse and so much more exacerbated because of the conditions that ECs have experienced. But I also know, when we're talking about the childcare workforce challenge or the workforce problem or the workforce crisis, the one thing that I always try to remind myself of is that, early child educators are also our superpower. They're our superpower. They're what powers childcare programs. They are the key to quality. And they're also our superpower as a social movement, because it's ECEs and their ability to tell and talk about the work that they do and its importance that actually helps connect to parents, families, and decision makers. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But just to summarize what I think Jane was saying, we talked about this before. I have a slide that just says, like, we already know what won't and what will solve the workforce crisis in childcare. We know that we can't recruit our way out of it. And I always like to say this at the outset, because recruiting more ECEs into the field is very important. But until we address retention, it's never going to be enough. There's a great graphic from Berkeley, the childcare studies there. They did a meme that shows like water being poured into a sieve, and it just falls out onto the floor. So you can't just keep adding more ECEs until we deal with retention. And here in Ontario, we know that the average early child educator only stays working in licensed childcare for 3 years before moving on to another part of the sector or out of early years in childcare work entirely. We also know we can't enhance our way out of it. As Jane was saying, the $1, $2 an hour enhancements aren't what's going to fix this. And we can't deregulate our way out of it, which I know is something else that governments are going to turn to, looking at, group sizes and ratios as a way to solve the workforce shortage. And we know that we can't do that because of reasons of quality and stability for young kids. So we do know what will solve it. Addressing retention first, I think, is the big issue. And we know that it has to be about decent work and pay. And this is not to say that all other issues are not important, but until we have proper compensation for early child educators, we're not going to solve the workforce crisis. So for me, when talking with decision makers about it, it has to be the top issue, or it just gets ignored. And putting in decent work standards, and then making proper compensation an integral part of publicly funded budgets, which is what we're finally going to be able to do now that we have the Canada-wide early learning and childcare system. And I'm going to be talking with some of our member centers here in Ontario next week about how they can budget for quality. Now that their childcare center budgets are going to be much more publicly funded, now that we've cut that invisible line between parent fees and wages, where it's not always being tied together. So how we can move that forward. So I always like to include a slide about the ACO's Decent Work Charter, because it's a great tool to talk with decision makers and to talk with families and the general public about how important decent work and pay for ECEs is and how it's tied to quality in early childhood programs. And so what this does for folks in Ontario will know this wheel very well, because it's what forms part of How Does Learning Happen, which is our curriculum framework in Ontario for the early years in childcare. And it talks, the curriculum framework talks about belonging, well-being, engagement, and expression for young children. And what the AACO's Decent Work Charter has done is to tie these to, elements of decent work for ECEs. And that those two are fundamentally tied together. So we use this charter to help us develop the recommendations that we put into our roadmap to universal childcare in Ontario, which states for us in Ontario, we've called for development of a salary scale that ensures a minimum starting wage of $25 per hour for all working in licensed childcare and $30 per hour for RACEs. And benefits across the sector. We know that our sector is nowhere near this right now. The Ontario government and the agreement that they signed with the federal government brings in a wage floor that's just an hour, and it's the enhancement grant, so it's actually just a little bit more than minimum wage, really, is a base salary. But for us, this is what we want to push toward. It's what we've settled on. It's based on what we heard from ECEs, and this is what we're pushing forward. And of course, also, to include licensed home childcare providers and figuring out how to have daily rate minimums and really how to have benefit options improve work in licensed home childcare. We also call for decent work standards to support pedagogical practice, including planning time, paid sick days, emergency leave days, and early childhood learning framework. And creating practitioner roles and placing educational requirements alongside the career ladder so that there's actually, advancement working in licensed childcare. All of these are really just ways to change a work in licensed childcare for something that somebody does for 3 years before they burn out or leave to work at Costco because that pays their bills better, turning licensed childcare from that kind of work into a career. And that's, I think, what we have to really focus on. The last slide, you'll notice the photograph is the same person who's on the cover of the Forgotten on the Frontline report. This is Jess Tomas. They're an early childhood educator who worked through the pandemic, with their full PPE, and now has gone to work with the Association of Early Childhood Educators as a community organizer, and as a union member of QP 2484. Has helped their local bargaining unit of 30 different childcare centers have their first real collective coordinated bargaining across the entire local. And so for me, Jess is an inspiration, and they're an example of this ECE-led movement for change. And I think that, what we want to do is make sure that this issue is just top of mind. It has to be a priority for our movement. I can't tell you, when the Canada-wide Early Learning and Childcare Agreement was announced here in Ontario, we had celebrations, right? Especially in Ontario, because we were the very last to sign on. But when early child educators and childcare workers found out that, for them, it was still an $18 an hour wage floor, and that only 3% of all the millions and millions of dollars of funding was actually going to go to enhance wages in the sector, they felt betrayed by that. They felt betrayed by politicians who signed that agreement, but they also felt betrayed by the movement that had fought so hard for childcare, for this plan that was still leaving ECEs behind. So I think that now, we're making sure that childcare workforce issues are going to be the top priority as we move forward, because it's going to be the only way that we solve the childcare workforce shortage, increase access for families, and increase quality by ensuring decent work and pay for ECEs. So thanks, everybody, and I look forward to the discussion and questions.
Thank you, Carolyn. And we're going to turn to a question period. I saw that a lot of questions were going into the chat, and Morna is going to field them, moderate them. And we have more than half an hour, is that right?
Well, I guess we have as long as people will hang in, but
Thank you.
we were trying to limit this to about an hour and 15 minutes. And we have so many comments and so many questions in the chat already. So I would just make one observation right at the start, is there seems to be such a strong appetite to have this kind of discussion on workforce issues, and also on so many of the issues, policy issues that relate to the crisis, the workforce crisis that we're experiencing in this sector at this time. So I'm not going to do justice. I don't think I can pick up. I'm going to pick up a few threads. And Chris, I wonder if, since you started, if I could start with you. So you spoke, for example, you spoke about the need to raise pre-service training and qualifications. And make, of course, a compelling case. And there were a lot of comments in the chat about this need for, access to post-secondary education, more equitable access to post-secondary education, that raising the qualifications and the training of those in the sector is one of the ways to ensure that the work is respected and valued. But I'm wondering, how do you reconcile that, on the one hand, saying we need more qualified, higher qualified, with this severe labor shortage that we're experiencing in the sector? How do those two, how do you deal with both? And I would say, existing programs can't even survive because of the staff shortage. And there's also this huge pressure to expand the number of spaces. And so I suspect there's going to be a lot of pressure to actually bring more people into the sector who don't have post-secondary education and so forth. So could you just comment on that? I know you're going to say, well, we need a workforce strategy, but specifically, how would the strategy address this, reconcile these, I think, really immediate and strong tensions?
Yeah, so I mean, I just saw actually Christy put something in there, so thanks for the comment, Christy. I'll make a comment that's related more. I think when we talk about the educational preparation of the workforce, we're talking about supporting qualified, well-prepared, supported individuals. But it's really difficult for well-qualified, supported individuals to work in incompetent organizations or incompetent systems, right? That leads to the issues around retention. In other words, they don't stay, right? Because they have a vision of the field, a vision of profession, and so they don't stay. So I really believe, Mona, the critical question is around retention. How do we make sure that the strong staff who are in the field stay? And how do we actually make sure for every early childhood educator that's working in the field in Canada now, we say thank you. We want to now work with you to support your development in the field. What I would say more, and I was struck by this, I'm sure others were as well, when the budget announcements were made in April 2021 and the kind of, the investment was talked about, the expansion, I would have anticipated that every provincial government ministry that's responsible for early learning childcare would have said, oh my goodness, we're going to have a workforce challenge, right? We had just limped out of the pandemic, and they presumably would have started planning, but they didn't do it. So now we're in hurry up offense. So I think what we have to say is the next 3 years are the foundational years for improving that pre-service education and bringing people in and supporting them moving along. But this is a 10-year initiative. We always said this would take 10 years to build a system. You won't build the kind of workforce that we need in the long term in the short term. You cannot do it, right? So we're going to have to make some really good line calls. But I think going back to what Carolyn ended with in there, if we're not investing in the wages and working conditions, we cannot keep saying to people, come on in, the water's lovely, this is a place to be. They will not come, or if they come, they will not stay. So I think this is a foundational reassessment and reevaluating. And just as other provinces in other jurisdictions, they've done labor market strategies. They need to do labor market strategies for early learning childcare, and there needs to be federal leadership in this, right? All of the provinces are in a very similar boat. I don't think individual programs, like Christy said, they can't find their way out of this on their own. Individual provinces perhaps can't find this way out on their own. So is this a time and a place for significant federal leadership in a labor market model approach? And so I think the answer is yes, but I don't think there's any short-term quick answers, Mona, other than we need to retain the staff we have now. We cannot recruit our way out of this. So I'll stop there and welcome the expert and better advice of others.
Do any of the other panelists want to quickly comment on that question? I have another one, Jane, heading your way about market-based approaches. But on this one, do any of the other panelists want to comment about this tension? Jane?
Well, just that I think it's going to be really important to know who we're starting with. We know that we have, most of the staff do not have appropriate qualifications. And so building in not just for pre-service education, but how to ensure that they can upgrade and get the appropriate credentials while they're maintaining employment without having to do it all in the evenings and weekends. But having a route, just like PEI did when they moved kindergarten to the school system and they hired early childhood educators and gave them 2 years with time off to get their appropriate degree. I think that's going to be a critical part of this.
Can I just follow up on that, Jane, and others comment too, because there's been a lot of discussion in the chat, or what is the best approach to ensuring that those who work in the sector have access to opportunities for ongoing learning, professional development, but also to get credentials. Can you mentioned PEI, could you just point to other good examples of programs that you know of in Canada or outside?
Yeah, certainly the Manitoba workplace model has been hugely successful, where experienced staff who are certified at an assistant level and don't have a 2-year diploma are given time away from their job, receiving their full pay, while they do an intensive ECE program that takes about 18 months instead of 2 years. But they're not doing it on their own time. They're still getting their salary. They can still keep working in government pays for backfill, which I guess is getting increasingly more difficult given the labor shortage. And it started at Red River and then expanded to some other post-secondaries. And I believe that some of that is it's a combination, depending on the college, of in-person classes and some virtual classes as well, which is really important, especially for those in rural and remote communities where there is no easy access to in-person classes.
Great, thanks. I'm going to come back to Jane on the market approach question, but Carolyn, sorry, did you want to?
No, sorry, I thought you were going to go straight to that, and I said, I'm sure.
No, I'm going to go to Carolyn, and then I'm going to come back.
Okay.
Carolyn, questions are coming up in the chat around this whole question of strategies to address the very low wages and poor compensation as one piece to addressing retention. You have been watching this really closely in different jurisdictions, and I'm wondering if you could share if you have any impressions about the different wage strategies that provincial governments have taken to date or since the signing of these agreements, and do you see any signs of hope out there? And if not, what are your concerns? So I don't know, for example, if you've taken a look at the Nova Scotia wage grid. I know that you have in Ontario, there's been proposals in BC. Just could you comment on that, the strategies around wage grid, but also other strategies for addressing the low wages?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as to any hope, the hope I have is in the power and organizing of our movement to actually push this forward. Because certainly here in Ontario, what they're doing in terms of a wage floor is completely inadequate. I know there have been a lot of issues around in Nova Scotia that they didn't have one for a long time, and then they put out a salary grid, but it's not anywhere near what it needs to be. But I think that one of the key things that we're trying to work on is ensuring that early childhood educators' voices are heard in this, and some ways of making that happen. Like it's fine to say that, and certainly like we'll run public campaigns about that, but we're also trying to push ways that, that early child educators are part of the consultation and policy making that governments are doing. And I know that, so I'm in a province where that's happening as little as humanly possible in terms of consultations that our government's doing. But that doesn't stop us from trying to push for ways to make that happen. So we have a private members bill that's going to it went to the legislature. Of course, the legislature then, dissolved, and now it's back. So it's coming back again. That's calling for an early years and childcare workforce commission that would have early childhood educators as part of that, along with other sector partners, to help inform that, like to create a workforce strategy that has a salary scale and decent work standards as part of it. And of course, the road mapping work that has been happening, that Childcare Now led, and that, in all of the provinces and territories, is calling for, salary scales. But I think that, in the absence of that, the other strategy that we're working on in Ontario with directors of childcare centers is around budgeting for quality and budgeting for decent work and pay. Because there's nothing that's stopping them from doing that at this point. For years, as I said in my presentation, for years, we couldn't raise early child educators' wages because their parent fees went high. And I think that is starting to, to really, people are starting to understand that more, as the months have gone on, that wait a second, why couldn't I put in a budget that has the wages that I've always wanted to be paying people, that actually has a big jump in wages? But, if that starts happening at the program level across the country, we're going to get to the issue of, is there enough money to fund this? And that's why we also have to be pushing at the federal level to have the federal government leading a workforce strategy, that they're hearing that there actually does need to be more money, because there does. And also the provinces and territories. I really worry that, we've gone from a place where provinces were saying the federal government has no role in childcare to their provinces are never going to put in another penny of their own money. That's what it feels like in Ontario. So I think we have to push at every level to make this happen. And of course, public campaigns like Dots for Spots and the Day of Action are going to be part of that.
Thanks so much, Carolyn. Jane, I wanted to raise this question because there was a comment in the chat from somebody Jennifer, who talked about having worked in very, very difficult conditions and situations because of what she calls the market-based approach to early learning and childcare. Now, Jennifer is specifically, I think, making reference to when she speaks to market-based approach to essentially a profit-making approach, and that how difficult it is. So I'm just wondering if you could explain, because in your presentation, you say one of the key strategies is we have to move from a market-based approach. Can you very quickly elaborate on what you mean? Because these terms get used differently by different people. So you don't mean just moving away from profit-making, because presumably the not-for-profit sector is also embedded until now anyway in a market-based system. So can you just expand on that?
Sure. Thanks. That is a really good question, because a lot of people do think of this simply as in the for-profit sector and, people making profits from childcare. But a market-based system is one in which government plays a much more reactive role than they do with public services. There's not a lot of regulation. And it's really about buying and selling goods and services out there in the marketplace with prices, that community will bear. So it's a very individualistic approach that, and when there's not enough supply, it's all about competition among programs. And so, whereas when it's publicly funded, when it's universal, when it's a public good, my use of it doesn't affect your ability to use it. And government has to play a much more involved role, play a bigger role, not just simply offer grants for people to apply to and let operators decide what they're going to pay their staff. And, a whole bunch of other aspects of it, planning and management. they need to play a much bigger role. And if you think of the public sector, like you would no more give a public servant a wage top-up as a way of addressing their salary, or government just saying, well, it's up to this department what people are paid, and that department over there can, pay something different. So I hope that answers part of it.
That's really helpful. So I'm really conscious of time, and we had one of the first questions that went into the chat, I think would be a good question to ask each one of you. So the comment in the chat was, I have an opportunity to meet with Karina Gould. What should I tell her? So we have a workforce crisis. We need system change. What would you say to Karina Gould? Maybe you can talk about what you've already said, because some of us have written recently to Minister Gould on this very topic of workforce. So Jane, you're big on my screen. You start, then I'm going to go to Chris, and then end with Carolyn on this question.
Well, I guess since you could probably only talk very briefly to her or communicate with her, I would say that the federal government has a responsibility to develop a national workforce strategy in consultation with provinces and territories and the sector. In terms of these Canada-wide agreements, I think it's really important that they play a more active role in monitoring what provinces are doing and understanding how they're implementing what's in those agreements, because I think they might find that it's not quite the way they had envisioned or hoped. So those are the two immediate things I would say to her.
Great. Chris, what would you say to Minister Gould?
Yes, and I think Mona was referring to something we sent to her very recently. So I guess I would say two things, Mona. First one is that this is going back to where Martha started. Keep the faith, okay? Keep the faith. As a federal government, keep that vision of a publicly funded, publicly managed, high quality, accessible early learning childcare. Keep it. Do not move away from it. That is the foundational change that Martha talked about. That is it. That is the key thing. And as part of that, I think what we need to think about with Minister saying, Minister, we're going to have to do expectations management about the time it's going to take to move towards that system. And she said this as well, there's going to be things that don't go well, but we need to keep the faith. We need to have that vision. That needs to be central to what we do. And every decision that we make at a policy level and guidelines need to be consistent with that vision, but do not give that away. If you give that away, you've given an Alberta reference, you've given away the family farm. That has been worked for and fought for 50 years. Do not give that away. And so I'll just stop there. Thanks, Mom.
Thanks, Chris. Carolyn.
It's a good question. I think I would say, if I was speaking to Minister Gould, start with the positive. I mean, the $10 a day childcare plan, the Canada-wide plan, is amazing, life-changing, game changer for families, and it's happening. And it's going to be very popular. It's going to be so popular that we have to raise our ambitions. We have to think bigger. We're going to need many more spaces than are currently planned. And to serve the families that are going to want into this program, we need to solve the workforce crisis, right? We won't be able to serve the families we have now, let alone expand, unless we solve the workforce crisis. And to do that, I think anybody talking to Minister Gould has to be honest that we need more money, right? We have to make that hard ask. We can't just, this can't just be happening out of thin air, right? We need the federal government to have leadership coming from a conservative province. Our province isn't going to do anything unless everybody from, the grassroots to the federal government is pushing them to act. And so for Minister Gould, that means bringing together the provinces and territories and helping them be more ambitious, helping them to get into a race to do better here. And that means, to having better wages and having decent work standards as part of this system. It has to be foundational to making this work. And everybody wants to make this work. The minister wants this to work. This is her legacy.
Thanks so much. So as I said, we can't do justice to all these comments. The chat is so rich. And again, I want to go back to that we have to find more forums. This idea, Carolyn, of a commission, a workforce commission, whatever it takes, whether if governments don't do it, then let's us do it. Provide more forums for people to come together and have these kinds of policy discussion, because policy really matters. And because we are building, have this opportunity to build a completely different approach to early learning and childcare. And it's not going to be a good approach if the voices of those who are working in the sector and the voices of those who really, for a whole variety of reasons, want an affordable, accessible, high quality system, those voices need to be heard as well. So I wanted to end by letting everybody know that we have an opportunity on November 30th. The childcare movement has declared November 30th, a day of action for early learning and childcare. And on that day, across the country, we are going to be demanding from governments better pay, better quality, and better access. And I hope you will all visit childcarenow.ca in English and enfantuneplace.ca in French. And you'll get all the information you need on events that are being organized. Now, the calendar of events is pretty skimpy at this stage, where we need you to organize events. Let us know where the events are happening so we can add them to the calendar of events. And we need you to sign the petition on that website. So when you go to the website, click on Join Us, and it'll take you to a petition. Please sign it. But more importantly, get others to sign it. Send the link not just to your friends, to your coworkers, colleagues, to your neighbors. Get as many people. We need tens of thousands of signatures on this petition, and we will be using it, this petition, as a vehicle to make representations to all levels of government, provincial governments, territorial governments, and the federal governments. And on November 30th, please wear polka dots. See, we're all wearing polka dots. November 30th, wear polka dots, take a picture, send a message, use the hashtag dots4spots, all one word, or tag @child_care_now, so that we can amplify those photos and essentially have the largest virtual rally that we've had for childcare in a very long time. So Martha, over to you to say good night. And thank the panelists. You have to demute there.
I never mute myself. I've been really enjoying this and actually learning things. So, I mean, I think this is the kind of event that we have to have more of, so that people can get together. And, you know, it's part of learning and advocacy. And, you know, I've always linked advocacy to learning. So I think we're in that mode. There are so many important ideas here in the chat and amongst people. And I think we have to provide opportunities to make those voices heard. So all together, I think that's what we're going to be doing in the next 10 years. I want to thank Chris and Jane and Carolyn for a great panel, and Morna for moderating, and Erica for managing all the technical things and so on. And I hope that you'll be coming to the next in the webinar series, which is, I think, on December 7th, and you'll be hearing about it. And just keep the faith, and we're going to be pushing this forward and making it work. So thank you everybody for attending. I found it a great experience. Thank you.
Thank you.